Welcome to the deep dive. So glad you could join our fun little study group for PP 5340 Introduction to Public Policy and Management.
Great to be diving in.
Today we're tackling the readings from the required text, Essential History for Public Administration. We're hitting Chapter 3, focusing entirely on the transformative progressive era.
A really pivotal period, absolutely.
So our mission today is to really get our heads around this key time in American history.
Yeah.
We're talking roughly 1890 to 1920.
Right, give or take a few years on either end, but that's the core.
And this era, it didn't just, tweak things around the edges. It fundamentally reshaped the whole role of government in American society.
It really did. It's like a bridge, a crucial one, connecting the founding era ideals with the complexities we face today.
A dynamic bridge, yeah. A time when the very fabric of American life felt like it was being pulled apart and then kind of meticulously rewoven.
That's a great way to put it. And we're not here just to, list dates and famous names. That's not the goal.
No, definitely not.
We want to get beneath the surface, uncover the really dramatic shifts, social, economic, political, that didn't just make reform possible, but made it feel absolutely necessary for people at the time.
Okay, so what drove it?
Well, we'll explore the huge problems that came from that super fast industrialization and urbanization, just massive changes happening very quickly.
Right. Too fast, maybe, for society to keep up initially.
Exactly. And we'll look at the people, the individuals, the groups who pushed so hard for change, and then the lasting impact, how it affected public administration, the actual structure of government.
That's the key for us in this course, right?
Right.
Connecting it to public admin today.
Precisely. You'll see that a lot of the mechanisms, even the philosophical underpinnings of today's public sector, their roots are firmly planted right here in the progressive era.
It's honestly fascinating because so many things we just take for granted now.
Like what?
Well, like women voting or, having some confidence that the food you buy isn't packed with, sawdust or something dangerous.
Right. Basic safety regulations, food and drug safety, workplace safety too, eventually.
Yeah. Those things have their origins right here. So this deep dive, it should be full of those little nuggets of knowledge, those aha moments.
Hopefully, yeah. Showing how the past really shapes the present we live in.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start?
Well, to really appreciate the progressive era, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of change that happened just before it in the late 19th century.
Setting the stage. Makes sense.
Think about the contrast. America in 1800, overwhelmingly rural, agrarian, people living off the land mostly.
Right. Small towns, farms.
Then fast forward just one century to 1900, it's a completely different country. Bustling cities, huge factories, an urban industrial economy.
That shift in just 100 years is kind of mind-boggling.
It wasn't gentle. The text calls it a societal earthquake. It changed everything. Daily life, communities, how people worked, everything.
So what was the engine behind that earthquake? Technology, I assume.
Absolutely. It was built on this accelerating foundation of technological innovation. Go back to the early mid-19th century, the steam engine starts it off.
Powering factories.
Right. Textile mills, flour mills, sawmills, and steamships too, changing water transport completely.
Okay.
Then, after the Civil War, say the 1860s onwards, the pace just ramps up dramatically.
Or the railroads.
Exactly. The Transcontinental Railroad gets completed. Suddenly, you can cross the country in days, not months. It shrinks the continent, metaphorically speaking.
Huge.
And at the same time, they lay a telegraph cable across the Atlantic, connecting the U.S. and Europe.
Instant communication, almost.
Compared to waiting weeks for a ship. Yeah, basically instantaneous. It changed the speed of business, news, even personal life.
Wow. So by the turn of the century, around 1900, things must have felt incredibly fast-paced, especially in the cities.
Oh, definitely. The text quotes a British visitor from 1900 who described American life as one perpetual whirl of telephones, telegrams, phonographs, electric bells, motors, lifts, and automatic instruments.
A perpetual whirl that captures it.
And political scientist Jeffrey Isaac, writing much later, called America in 1900 a vast construction site in which the foundations of a modern industrial society were being laid.
So not just individual inventions, but how they all came together.
That's the key insight, really. It's the interconnectedness, the explosive growth. This created a society so complex that the old sort of hands-off government approach just wasn't working anymore.
It created a dilemma for government.
A massive one. You've got steel production making skyscrapers possible, electric refrigeration creating national markets for food. The internal combustion engine?
Cars.
Right, cars went from maybe 8,000 in 1895 to 2.5 million just 5 years later, in 1900. An incredible jump.
Unbelievable speed.
Plus, you have the telephone, the typewriter revolutionizing offices,
Yeah.
electric wiring bringing appliances into homes, irons, washing machines, toasters. It hinted at a totally different future.
Just trying to imagine living through that. The speed of it all must have been incredibly disorienting for ordinary people.
You have to think so. Everything was changing. Where you lived, how you worked, what your town looked like.
So let's get specific. What did this rapid change mean for daily life? What were living conditions actually like?
Okay, let's paint a picture using the contrasts mentioned in the text. Think about 1870. Not that long before the Progressive Era really kicks off.
Right.
In 1870, virtually no homes had electricity. You're using candles, kerosene lamps, maybe gas lamps if you're in a city and well off,
Dark evenings.
and cold mornings. Heating was wood or coal stoves, no central heating. Houses were cold when you woke up.
And plumbing.
Forget about it for most people. No running water inside. You're using chamber pots, outdoor privies, maybe a communal pump down the street.
Okay, pretty rough by our standards. Did things improve by the start of the Progressive Era, say 1890?
Some, but slowly. The text notes that even in 1890, complete bathrooms were still unusual. Muncie, Indiana apparently had no more than 24.
Wow. So progress was slow at first.
But then it accelerated. By 1900, the text says most new city houses were being built connected for electricity, water, and sewer. So things were changing for some.
And outside the home, streets, transport.
City streets were getting paved more often, which was a big deal.
Mm.
But rural roads, still mostly dirt and mud. Transport was mixed electric streetcars, and those newfangled gas autos were appearing. But horse-drawn carriages were common right into the 1920s.
So a real mix of old and new side by side.
Definitely. But we can't romanticize it. Even with improvements, city life could be grim, especially for the poor.
How so?
In densely packed areas, like parts of New York, the text describes streets choked with large piles of garbage and covered in inches thick of muck paper, rags, rotting food, manure, mud, ashes, just filth.
Ugh. And this was worse in certain areas.
Especially in the poorer immigrant neighborhoods, people were jammed into small, dark tenement spaces with communal toilets and few resources. It's quite stark.
And the reformers saw this.
They saw it as a major problem. The text mentions reformers felt it was essential to teach these, quote, urban nationalities about cleanliness. It highlights the huge challenges of absorbing so many people into cities so quickly.
Okay, so living conditions were tough, especially for many. What about work? You mentioned the economy was changing. How did that affect how people earned a living?
That's another fundamental shift, a really critical point. For a long time in the 19th century, there was this strong cultural ideal, right? Men should be self-supporting, independent, farmers, artisans.
The Jeffersonian ideal?
Exactly. Owning your own farmer shop, working for wages, being an employee was actually looked down upon by many. The text says it was considered demeaning, even compared to slavery sometimes. They used terms like hirelings.
Wow, that's a different mindset.
Totally different.
Yeah.
But that ideal was just crashing against the rocks of economic reality.
Because of the factories.
Factories, railroads, mines, all needing workers. The numbers are staggering. Mid-19th century made 1 million hourly workers. By 1914, on the eve of World War I, 7 million. Plus, millions more paid weekly or monthly.
So America was becoming.
A nation of employees, as one historian put it. A huge shift away from self-employment.
And what were those jobs like? Factory work?
Often repetitive, low skill, pretty dangerous in many cases, and long hours. The average work week was around 60 hours.
60 hours? That's intense.
Yeah. But interestingly, at the same time, you also see the rise of professions.
Like doctors, lawyers.
And engineers, managers, accountants, new occupations based on specialized knowledge and training. So it was also the era of the growing professionalization of American society, a real contrast happening simultaneously.
Okay, so stepping back again.
Yeah.
Looking at this whole period, late 19th century through the Progressive Era, it sounds like a paradox. Incredible progress, amazing inventions, but also really profound difficulties.
That's exactly right. The text emphasizes this dual nature. Technology improved life for millions, no doubt, but it also created living and working conditions for many others that were so bad, so dire, that they fueled these widespread calls for reform.
And the progress itself had costs,
Yeah.
right? Not just the urban issues.
Huge costs. The narrative of building the nation often leaves out the darker side. Westward expansion meant the forced displacement, often violently, of Native Americans from their lands.
Right.
And a lot of that land in the West and Southwest was taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Mexico lost over half its territory.
We don't always think about that context.
And in the South, after the Civil War, slavery ends legally, but it's replaced by a system of sharecropping that was deeply racially oppressive. The promises of Reconstruction for racial equity, they basically failed by the 1870s. White control and economic exploitation of Black Americans became the norm.
So the end of slavery didn't mean equality.
Far from it. And even think about women. They were heavily involved in reform movements, as we'll see, but they lacked full voting rights in most places until the 19th Amendment in 1920, right at the very end of this era.
Still fighting for basic political rights.
Exactly. And on the world stage, too, America was changing dramatically, shifting from sort of avoiding foreign entanglements to actively intervening overseas.
Like a Spanish-American War.
Precisely. Annexation of Hawaii in 1893, then the war in 1898, where the U.S. invaded Cuba, took control of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam. Theodore Roosevelt was actually involved in that war before becoming president.
So becoming a global power.
And one historian, Stephen Kinzer, details something like 14 U.S. regime change interventions over the next century, often driven by economic interests. That pattern starts here.
It's such a striking contrast, all of it. This mix of innovation, wealth, but also hardship and injustice. That term, the Gilded Age, seems to fit perfectly.
It really does capture the contradiction. It comes from a satirical book by Mark Twain, pointing out the corruption hidden beneath a thin layer, the gilding of wealth.
And this was the post-Civil War period leading up to the Progressives.
Yes, an era where incredible fortunes were made. Think Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil, Morgan in finance, Vanderbilt in railroads, the robber barons, as they were sometimes called.
Because they created monopolies.
Yeah.
Trusts.
Exactly. They amassed huge power, often crushing competition. This concentration of wealth and power became a major concern.
Did the government try to do anything?
Well, Congress did pass the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. The idea was to counter these monopolies. But it wasn't used very aggressively at first. Until Teddy Roosevelt became president in the early 20th century. He really made a name for himself as a trust buster, using that act much more forcefully.
Okay, but before Roosevelt, during the Gilded Age proper,
the wealth concentration was extreme. And you had weak business regulation, plus these recurring economic downturns, they call them panics. It led to a society that, as one historian said, seemed to be dividing into hostile classes. The extremely wealthy and the very poor.
And the government wasn't stepping in to help those at the bottom.
Very little relief for the unemployed, the elderly, the sick. So the gap just widened. Jeffrey Isaac paints that picture again. City skylines showing off wealth and culture, but down below you find the dispossessed, beggars, and child laborers, symbols of poverty.
So progress and poverty side by side.
Exactly. An era of progress, yes, but also a time of profound difficulty, disorientation, and suffering, as Isaac puts it.
And all this urban struggle, this poverty, was made even more intense by another huge factor: mass immigration.
Oh, absolutely. Immigration fueled the growth of cities, but also the concentrations of poverty and those poor living conditions we talked about.
What kind of numbers are we talking?
Huge numbers. Between 1870 and 1900, something like 12 million immigrants arrived, then another 9 million just in the first decade of the 20th century.
Wow. Where were they coming from?
Initially, up to the 1880s, mostly Northern and Western Europe, Britain, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia. But then a big shift started in the 1880s.
Where from then?
Increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Poland, the Balkans, Greece.
And how were these newer immigrant groups received?
Often not well. There was a significant backlash, a nativist reaction. Many established Americans saw them as a threat.
A threat how?
They were often depicted as swarms of inferior races. People worried they'd drive down wages, increase crime, bring diseases, just general fear and prejudice.
But the reality was more complex.
Of course. The text emphasizes many were strong, ambitious young men and women from overcrowded peasant villages, just looking for a better life, willing to work hard.
Was there actual legislation against immigrants?
Yes, a very stark example is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Targeted specifically at Chinese immigrants.
Yes, Chinese immigration had surged during the gold rush and for building the railroads. But racial tension, economic fears, Congress passed this act. It banned Chinese laborers from immigrating and even denied citizenship to those already here.
How long did that last?
That specific ban on laborers lasted until 1943, and even then, strict limits remained until 1965. A really clear example of the discriminatory side of this era.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty clear picture. Urban squalor, dangerous jobs, huge wealth gaps, social tensions, immigration backlash. Given all that, it makes perfect sense that people started to organize and demand change.
Absolutely. It wasn't just going to happen on its own. The discontent was real, and it started bubbling up from below. This wasn't just top-down policy. It was a groundswell.
Where did these movements first appear?
You see early forms of collective action even before the progressive era officially begins. Farmers, for instance, started organizing way back in the late 1860s.
What were they upset about?
Mostly economics. They were getting squeezed by high railroad freight rates to ship their crops, and they felt powerless against the middlemen, the grain elevator owners, the farm machinery companies.
So what did they demand?
Pretty radical stuff for the time. Government regulation, even government ownership of the railroads. They formed cooperatives, and they advocated for soft money, printing more paper money.
Why soft money?
To cause inflation, basically. It would make their debts easier to pay off. The text calls it a political ideology grounded in a desire of non-bankers to cope with changing commercial power relationships. It was about power as much as money.
And this farmer movement fed into later groups.
Yeah, it eventually merged with the populist or People's Party movement in the 1890s, a major force for a while.
Okay, so farmers were organizing. What about industrial workers?
They were organizing too, but it was an incredibly tough, often violent struggle.
Why violent?
Relations between labor and management were extremely tense, and the government, whether local, state, or federal, usually sided with the owners with management.
So strikes often led to conflict.
Frequently. Major strikes often involved confrontations, property destruction, and sometimes, sadly, deaths.
Any specific examples?
Oh, yeah. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was huge. Started over pay cuts, spread like wildfire, paralyzed rail traffic across the country. Federal troops were called in to suppress it.
Wow.
Then you have the Homestead Strike in 1892 at a Carnegie steel plant in Pennsylvania. A pitched battle between workers and Pinkerton guards hired by the company, eventually put down by the state National Guard.
And the Pullman strike.
That was 1894, centered in Chicago, but affecting rail traffic across the Midwest and West. Again, state and federal troops sent in. There was violence, hundreds of rail cars destroyed.
How bad did it get?
One confrontation, the text says, involved troops firing into a crowd of about 5,000 protesters. 13 people killed, over 50 seriously injured, hundreds arrested.
Just brutal. Were these strikes successful?
Often not in the short term. The Pullman strike, for example, was broken by a federal court injunction. Workers often had to pledge not to join a union just to get rehired. Unions were generally weak back then.
But they still mattered.
Absolutely. Even though they often failed and faced brutal opposition, these early labor battles laid the foundation. They were the crucible in which the American labor movement was forged.
So these are crucial early struggles, showing that deep discontent.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that it took a specific horrifying event to really galvanize public opinion and political will.
Yes, an event that brought the dangers and injustices into incredibly sharp public focus. That was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
When and where was this?
March 25, 1911, a Saturday afternoon in New York City's Greenwich Village.
And the conditions leading up to it were bad.
Terrible. The text quotes a worker describing garment factories back then. Dangerously broken stairways, windows few and so dirty, floors swept once a year, gas jets burning day and night, filthy malodorous lavatory, no fresh drinking water, mice and roaches. Just awful.
Working long hours in those conditions.
70 to 80 hours a week sometimes, including Saturdays and Sundays, according to that worker. These conditions pushed workers to try and organize, but change was incredibly slow.
So what happened on that day at the Triangle Factory?
There were about 500 people working, mostly on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. The vast majority were young immigrant women and girls, Italian and European Jewish, some as young as 14.
Young immigrants.
Facing, as the text says, grinding poverty and horrifying working conditions. Very vulnerable. The factory floors were packed with machines, cutting tables, and piles of flammable fabric scraps.
A fire hazard waiting to happen.
Exactly. A fire broke out in a scrap bin on the 8th floor, and it spread incredibly fast.
Could people get out?
Some did. Some made it to the roof. One stairway was open. The elevator made a few trips down before it became unusable because of the fire, and horrifically, the bodies of people who had jumped. Yes. The final death toll was 146 people, and a large number of those deaths were directly because of the company's practices, or lack thereof.
How so? What did the company do?
One main exit door was deliberately kept locked by supervisors. Why? To check workers' purses as they left, to prevent theft. That trapped people inside.
Locked them in.
Another stairwell was apparently locked at the bottom. Fleeing workers piled up against the locked door and died there.
Unbelievable. What about fire escapes?
There was one, but it was flimsy metal. It buckled and collapsed under the weight of people trying to escape, sending about 24 plunging to their deaths.
Just compounding tragedies.
And we need context here. Workplace deaths were shockingly common then. One estimate suggests maybe 100 or more Americans died on the job every day in 1911. Mines, ships, factories.
So why did this fire have such an impact?
Because it was so public, so visible. A large crowd gathered below. They watched it happen. Frances Perkins, who later became FDR's Secretary of Labor, was actually there. She witnessed it.
They saw people jump.
Yes. An estimated 54 people jumped from the upper floors to escape the flames. The newspapers described bodies crashing onto the sidewalk, forming mounds of the dead and dying. The public couldn't ignore this.
It brought the horror right out into the open.
And it exposed the utter lack of safety. Basic measures we expect now, firewalls, fire doors, proper fire stairs, automatic sprinklers, they existed, but they weren't required or used. Profit over safety.
What happened afterwards?
Huge public outcry, massive mourning processions, and importantly, a state legislative investigation.
Did it lead to change?
Yes. Despite, as the text notes, fierce resistance from business and real estate leaders, the investigation led to over 30 new state laws in New York covering factory safety, working conditions, fire prevention.
So it was a turning point.
A major one. It showed that government could act decisively when public opinion demanded it. And the Memory Triangle, the lessons learned, served as a powerful inspiration for later reforms, like those during the New Deal.
That event really did show that government could respond. It wasn't just an abstract idea. So this brings us back to the broader spirit of reform. What drove these progressives? What united them?
Right. Triangle was a catalyst, a symbol, but it happened within this much broader context. The progressive movement wasn't monolithic. It was decentralized.
Happening in lots of places on lots of issues.
Exactly. Driven sometimes by grassroots activism, bottom up, like the early labor and farmer movements. Other times driven by professionals, business leaders, politicians taking action.
So different groups involved.
Yes. Historian John Whiteclay Chambers described progressivism as a dynamic general reform effort composed of many specific social movements and shifting coalitions of self-interested groups uniting temporarily over different issues and behind different political leaders.
So temporary alliances around specific goals.
Often, yes. And these reformers, they weren't necessarily anti-government expansion, but they also strongly believed in private initiative and voluntary associations as alternatives to just having bigger government.
A balance, maybe.
They were looking for balance. And it's crucial to understand they were reformers, not revolutionaries. They wanted to fix the system, not overthrow it.
They believed in the basics. Democracy, capitalism.
Generally, yes. They supported only enough change to counteract the ills of what they considered a basically sound, liberal, democratic, capitalist system. They wanted to smooth the rough edges, address the injustices, make it work better.
When was this movement at its strongest?
The text suggests it really peaked nationally in the decade between about 1907 and 1917.
Just before and during World War I.
Right. But it started to weaken by the end of the war and kind of evaporated, as Chambers put it, in the 1920s.
The Roaring '20s.
Yeah. The focus shifted to boosterism, consumerism, individual self-concern, and aid to business. A very different mood. But the impact of that peak progressive decade was profound and lasting.
Okay, so this collective spirit, this groundswell, led to real changes in how government operated. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of how they reshaped the public sector.
Definitely. The progressive era sparked a huge wave of legislation and policy innovation, especially at the state and local levels first. It really created the blueprint for the modern regulatory state.
What kinds of things were states and cities doing?
A whole range. The text lists things like establishing juvenile courts and detention centers, creating public playgrounds and parks, big steps in public health vaccinations, ensuring pure public water supplies.
Things we expect now.
Exactly. Pure food and drug laws started appearing at the state level. Regulations on building construction, housing conditions, laws tackling child labor, setting maximum hours and minimum wages, at least for women and public employees. Workers' compensations started.
So government getting involved in protecting people.
And shaping the physical environment, too. Early zoning ordinances, modern property tax systems, even educational reforms, professionalizing teaching, creating special education programs.
What does all this signal taken together?
It signals a fundamental shift in the philosophy of government, moving away from just being a distant referee towards being an active protector, an active provider, intervening in daily life to try and solve problems. That shift really defines the modern public sector.
And this wasn't just happening locally. The national government got involved too, right? In ways it hadn't before.
Yes, that's a crucial part of the story. The federal government started stepping into areas previously considered outside its purview, expanding its regulatory power significantly.
What are the key examples?
Two really stand out, according to the text: food safety and environmental conservation.
Food safety that connects back to the jungle.
Precisely. Investigative journalists, the muckrakers, played a huge role here. They exposed just horrific conditions in meat packing plants and other food industries.
People knew things were bad before Sinclair's book, though.
Oh, yes. Warnings about adulterated food, dangerous chemical preservatives, they'd been around since the 1880s. But The Jungle, published in 1906, was so graphic, so visceral, it created a public uproar that President Theodore Roosevelt couldn't ignore.
So Roosevelt got involved directly.
He did. He sent his own investigators to Chicago. When they confirmed Sinclair's descriptions, maybe even said it was worse, Roosevelt used that political leverage. He pushed Congress hard.
And got laws passed.
Yes. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Both had been stuck in Congress, but Roosevelt's push got them passed on the same day in 1906, a landmark moment for federal regulation.
Okay, that's food safety. What about the environment?
This was a real personal passion for Theodore Roosevelt. He was a lifelong outdoorsman, a hunter, a naturalist. Even before becoming president, he'd worked to protect Yellowstone.
So he brought that passion to the presidency.
Big time. He took really significant actions. He created the Bureau of Forestry, later the U.S. Forest Service, established 51 federal bird refuges, protected dozens of natural areas, including the Grand Canyon, and set aside 150 national forests.
That's huge legacy. Was it popular at the time?
Not universally, no. The text notes these efforts were fiercely resisted by the timber, mining, and other interests, and by many in Congress. They saw it as government overreach, hindering economic development.
But Roosevelt pushed through.
He did. And his actions really marked the point where the federal government became a major player in conservation, in protecting natural resources from purely private exploitation.
Did he talk about why it was important?
Yes, he had a clear vision. In a 1910 speech quoted in the text, he said, "There is a delight in the hardy life of the open. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value."
Thinking about future generations.
A key conservationist idea. So the overall impact of all this: a dramatic expansion of federal power in trade, banking, health, environment, labor.
And this required a bigger government workforce.
Absolutely. It was underwritten by the growth of the federal bureaucracy. New departments were created or strengthened: agriculture, interior, labor. The executive office itself grew.
So the birth of the regulatory state.
Essentially, yes, a recognition that a complex industrial economy needed, as the text says, the moderating and coordinating efforts of the public sector. The Progressive Era laid that crucial foundation.
Okay, so government is expanding, taking on new roles. This obviously required changes to how government itself was run. The old systems wouldn't cut it anymore.
Exactly right. The old ways like dual federalism and the spoils system were proving inadequate for this new complex reality. The machinery of government had to evolve.
How did it evolve? Let's start with size.
Well, we saw the numbers. The federal civilian workforce just ballooned from about 95,000 in 1880 to over 430,000 by 1917. A massive increase.
And that challenged old ideas about federal versus state power.
It definitely challenged dual federalism. That traditional view held that the national and state governments had separate spheres. National does defense, interstate commerce, states handle local stuff, education, based on the 10th Amendment.
Like two separate layers of cake.
Kind of. But that neat separation was already being blurred before the progressives. Think Henry Clay's American system back in the 1820s, or the Morrill Act giving federal land for state colleges during the Civil War.
So the lines weren't perfectly clear even then.
No. And the Progressive Era reforms further eroded that strict separation. The idea of dual federalism really faded with the big federal programs of the New Deal later on. But that tension, federal power versus state power, still a huge debate today.
Absolutely. Okay, besides the size and federal-state relations, what about who worked for the government? The spoils system.
That was a huge target for reform. The spoils system meant government jobs were rewards for political loyalty. You helped the party win, you got a job. And you were often expected to kick back some money or time to the party.
Not based on merit.
Not at all, based on who you knew, which party you supported. But a shocking event helped change that.
What happened?
The assassination of President James Garfield in 1881. He was shot by someone who felt they'd been unfairly denied a government job they thought they deserved under the spoils system.
Wow, that's a direct link.
It created huge pressure for reform. Just 2 years later, in 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act.
What did that do?
It required competitive exams for certain federal jobs, merit over politics. It also limited political activity by federal employees while on the job.
Did it end the spoils system overnight?
No, not at all. Initially, it only covered about 10% of the federal workforce, but it was a crucial first step, a symbolic marker of the shift from informal, patronage-based systems to modern, professional, position-based public service.
So professionalizing the workforce.
Yeah.
Any other key ideas emerging about how administration should work?
Yes, and this comes from someone who later became president, Woodrow Wilson, but back in 1887, he was a professor.
What did he propose?
He wrote an essay called The Study of Administration. He argued for making public administration efficient, businesslike, professional. And importantly, he argued for separating partisan politics from the day-to-day technical work of running agencies.
The politics-administration dichotomy.
That's the idea it helped launch. Keep the political decisions separate from the neutral expert implementation. Now, the essay wasn't a huge splash at the time.
But it's seen as important now.
Very. Because Wilson was one of the first to really ask fundamental questions about how administration should function in a democracy. It's seen as a key moment in the formation of public administration as its own field of study and practice.
Okay, so bigger government, more professional workforce. How did they pay for all this?
The perennial question. That rapid growth strained the traditional revenue sources, which were mostly tariffs on imports and taxes on things like alcohol and tobacco.
Not enough money coming in.
Not for the scale of activity envisioned. An income tax had been tried during the Civil War, but the Supreme Court effectively struck it down in 1895, saying certain types couldn't be levied directly on individuals, but had to be apportioned among states by population. Very cumbersome.
So they needed a constitutional change.
Exactly. The push for an income tax amendment gained steam during the Progressive Era. Congress passed the resolution in 1909, and by 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified.
And that allowed.
It allowed the federal government to levy income taxes directly on individuals and corporations without that complicated apportionment requirement. This provided the financial engine needed to power the expanding administrative state.
So you get the structure, the personnel reform, and the funding mechanism all developing in this period.
Pretty much. The key pieces of the modern administrative state start falling into place.
Now, all this change wasn't just happening at the federal level. You mentioned state and local reforms earlier. How were cities and towns specifically changing how they were run? They must have been overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed is a good word for it. Industry booming, immigrants pouring in. Local governments just exploded in complexity and responsibility.
More services needed.
Way more. The text uses Brooklyn, New York as an example. In 1872, typical functions: police, fire, health, maybe some public works. By 1898, add courts, prisons, charities, libraries, museums, playgrounds, public baths, street cleaning, garbage collection, even publicly owned utilities. A huge expansion.
Public health seems like a big area of growth.
Massive. Massachusetts had the first state board of health back in 1869, but by 1900, 40 states had them. Local boards tackled pure food, disease control, housing sanitation, sewage, water, plumbing. Detroit added milk and meat inspection, health education, trying to make dense urban living safer.
Were basic services improving?
Slowly. Even by 1900, outdoor privies were still common in smaller cities. Garbage collection was just becoming accepted as something the city should handle. Firefighting was shifting from volunteer groups to professional departments.
But this is also the era of political machines, right?
Yeah.
Corruption.
Yes, that's the problematic side. Local government structure was often fragmented. You'd have an elected mayor, a city council, sometimes two chambers, maybe separately elected department heads plus appointed boards. Power was scattered.
Which made it easy for bosses to step in.
Exactly. Local political machine bosses held enormous sway. They provided informal assistance, especially to immigrants who felt ignored by formal government. They handed out city jobs patronage in return for votes and campaign support.
And the corruption.
That fragmented structure made oversight difficult. It was easier for politicians and bosses to arrange government contracts for kickbacks, skim money off the top. It was often quite blatant.
So the progressives wanted to clean this up.
Yes. Addressing municipal inefficiency and corruption was a major goal, especially for business leaders and professionals who valued order and, well, efficiency.
What was their main approach?
Centralization. They wanted to centralize executive decision-making, give one person or maybe a small group clear authority to coordinate all the city's operations, make someone accountable.
Did specific models emerge?
Two key forms of city government really developed during this era and are still dominant today: the mayor-council form and the council-manager form.
Okay, tell us about the mayor-council form first.
This was often presented as a reform model at the time. The idea was to strengthen the elected mayor, giving them clear executive authority, managing daily operations, developing the budget, proposing laws, hiring, firing staff, veto power over the council, like a mini president for the city.
Where do we see that today?
Still common. The text says about 34% of U.S. cities use it, especially older, larger cities, but also some very small ones, more common in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest.
And the other model, council manager.
This one concentrates executive authority differently. It puts it in the hands of an unelected professional city manager.
So not a politician running things day to day.
Right. The elected mayor and council set the laws and policies, and they hire a professional manager, ideally based on experience and qualifications, not politics, to handle the staffing, budget implementation, service delivery.
Like a CEO reporting to a board of directors.
That's the analogy often used. The manager serves at will, meaning the council can fire them. This form became very popular, seen as more efficient and less political.
Where is it common now?
Very common. Around 55% of U.S. cities, over 10,000 population, use it today, especially prevalent in the Southeast and on the Pacific coast. Think Phoenix, San Antonio, places like that.
It's important to remember how diverse local government is, though, right? Not just cities.
Absolutely. You've got general purpose governments, cities, counties, townships, but also tons of special purpose governments. School districts are the most common, but also districts for water, fire, transit, libraries, thousands of them. The 2012 census counted over 90,000 local government units in total.
Wow. So these progressive reforms, mayor, council, council manager, did they achieve their goals? And corruption?
It's complex. The motivations weren't always purely about good government. Sometimes it was about shifting power from immigrant-based machines to established business interests. But the overall result, the text argues, was local government that became far more efficient, accountable, and transparent than it was in earlier periods.
And these models continue to evolve.
Yes, you see hybrid forms today, like cities with chief administrative officers who assist the mayor. County governments have also adopted manager models. And debates continue about the best ways to elect mayors and councils at large versus district elections, for instance. It's an ongoing process of adaptation.
This focus on structure is fascinating. But the progressive era wasn't just about government machinery. It was also profoundly about citizens getting involved, right? Shaping their communities directly.
That's a crucial element. And there's a difference between levels of government here.
How so?
At the national and state levels, our connection is mostly indirect. We vote for representatives. The internet allows more input now, sure, but direct policymaking by average citizens is limited.
But locally.
Local government offers this unique blend. We have representation, yes, but also much more opportunity for direct participation. People attend council meetings, planning commission hearings, volunteer on committees.
And town meetings in some places.
Exactly. Especially in New England, some small towns still use the traditional town meeting where residents directly vote on the budget and other major issues. And beyond that, starting in the 60s and 70s, citizen participation became a more formal part of local government task forces, advisory boards, neighborhood groups.
And the progressive era was really a key time for this kind of direct citizen action, wasn't it? Especially for groups who maybe didn't have formal political power yet.
Absolutely. Women in particular played an enormous role even before they had the vote nationally.
How did they get involved, given the societal restrictions?
They were incredibly strategic. Despite expectations confining them to the home, activist women got involved in improving municipal services, fighting poverty, pushing for social policies. They cleverly framed their work using terms like public motherhood or municipal housekeeping.
Municipal housekeeping.
Yeah. The idea was the city is like a large home, and who better to clean it up, make it safe and healthy than women? It was a way to justify their public activity without seeming like they were, as the text says, inappropriately interfering in the male world of politics.
Mark, what kind of activities did they undertake?
Women's clubs were central. They organized to tackle very practical community problems, getting garbage collected regularly, cleaning up dirty alleys, arranging for medical inspections of school children. They even studied complex issues like tax assessment and city planning.
So not just advocacy, but research and action.
And direct program management, too. They didn't just call for change, they often ran things. The text mentions women establishing and managing things like domestic relations courts, child hygiene bureaus, hospital social service departments, recreation centers, juvenile courts, real, tangible services.
That's incredibly proactive, a powerful force for change from the ground up.
A profound force, yes, reshaping local government and public services, often led by these determined women.
And this powerful movement, this citizen action, often found a home in specific institutions, right? Hubs for change.
Exactly. Innovative institutions emerged that provided practical help while also serving as centers for advocacy and organizing. The most famous example is probably the settlement house movement.
Oh, Jane Addams.
She's the pioneer figure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Jane Addams co-founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889. She was inspired by a visit to Toynbee Hall in London, where university men lived among the poor to offer services and build bridges.
So middle-class reformers living in poor neighborhoods.
That was the model. Hull House started in an old mansion and grew into a complex of 13 buildings. The residents were typically young, educated people wanting to make a difference.
What kind of services did Hull House offer? It sounds huge.
An incredible range. Kindergarten and daycare for working mothers crucial, an employment bureau, an art gallery, libraries, classes in English and citizenship for immigrants, theater, music, art classes, clubs for different groups, even meeting space for trade unions. It was a real community hub.
Was Hull House unique?
Famous, yes, but not the first, and certainly not the only one. The movement spread rapidly. By 1890, there were over 400 settlement houses across the U.S., mostly in big industrial cities like Boston, Chicago, New York, but also in smaller ones, too.
So this was a real movement, not just isolated charities.
Definitely. Together with the women's clubs, business groups, unions, they formed this broader social reform movement that had real political clout.
They influenced policy.
Significantly.
Yeah.
They successfully pushed for state laws regulating child labor, setting maximum hours and minimum wages for women. The Chicago settlements were key in getting a local juvenile court established and even helped win partial suffrage for Illinois women in 1913. They also advocated for federal action, like the creation of the Children's Bureau.
What happened to the settlement houses? Are they still around?
The movement peaked around World War I. Then it declined somewhat. Factors included limits on immigration, the national focus shifting away from reform in the 20s, and also the staff becoming more professionalized, evolving into trained social workers. Many settlement houses transitioned into becoming more like modern neighborhood or community centers.
Okay, so settlement houses were one major example. What was the other one you mentioned? Social centers.
Right, the social centers movement. This started a bit later, around 1907, in Rochester, New York.
How did it begin?
Simply with people meeting in public schools after hours, it grew quickly. By 1910, Rochester had almost 20 civic clubs using school buildings, holding hundreds of meetings.
What did they discuss?
Real local issues. Streetcar development, housing problems, whether the city should own utilities, the school budget. Grassroots democracy in action.
Did it catch on elsewhere?
Yes, the idea spread rapidly, even though the Rochester movement itself faded due to political opposition from local bosses who didn't like being challenged. By 1912, social centers were active in over 100 cities, and several states had even passed laws allowing public funds to support them.
But this movement also declined.
Unfortunately, yes. During World War I, like many voluntary organizations, they were kind of co-opted for the war effort, promoting patriotism, selling war bonds. They lost that independent critical debate role.
And after the war?
The energy just dissipated. As we discussed, the 1920s saw that shift towards consumerism, private concerns. National attention moved away from local democracy and the public good.
Was there a sense that maybe citizens couldn't really handle governing?
That perspective gained ground. Walter Lippmann's influential 1922 book, Public Opinion, argued that the average citizen was ill-informed and easily swayed, and that governing should rely more on experts. This really symbolized the fading of that progressive era faith in direct, citizen-driven democracy.
But these movements still left a legacy.
Absolutely. Even though they declined in their original form, both settlement houses and social centers laid crucial groundwork. They provided models for later citizen participation efforts, and they were instrumental in the professionalization of social work as a field dedicated to addressing social problems.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's try to synthesize. What does all this mean? What's the big takeaway from the progressive era for understanding American history and public administration?
Well, the simplest way to put it is that this era, despite being relatively short, was a true hinge point. It fundamentally reshaped the nation.
How so? What was the main legacy?
It produced the basic framework for what the text calls the regulatory and administrative state. It laid the groundwork for how government would operate for much of the 20th century.
So it set up the machinery.
It set up the machinery and established the principle that government should intervene in the economy and society to address problems. Now, it didn't solve everything. Big challenges like managing the national economy comprehensively or tackling deep-seated poverty and racism, those were largely left for later eras like the New Deal and the Great Society.
But it created the tools and the expectation.
Exactly. Government became accepted as a major force, maybe the major force, capable of restraining the abuse of private power, protecting the environment, and actively working to improve the daily lives of Americans. That was a huge shift.
And the issues they grappled with. Do they still feel relevant?
Incredibly relevant. Urbanization, industrialization, now maybe deindustrialization or technological disruption, the growth of large corporations, think big tech today, immigration, social inequality. The forms change, but the underlying challenges highlighted by the progressives are still with us.
The text mentions common themes then and now.
Yes, protecting people and the environment from the negative consequences of economic activity. Dealing with concentrations of private power, the conflicts between public interests and private interests, between insiders and outsiders, these are perennial themes in American public life.
And that Triangle Fire story serves as a stark reminder.
A powerful reminder of the resistance to change, especially when profits or established ways of doing things are threatened. It shows why regulation and oversight, even when unpopular with some, can be literally life-saving.
So the progressive reform impulse eventually faded in the 1920s.
It did. The Roaring Twenties had a different focus, but the foundation laid during the progressive era, absolutely critical, because when the nation faced the catastrophe of the Great Depression in the 1930s,
They had structures and ideas to build on.
precisely, the experience of the progressive era, the expansion of government power, the development of administrative capacity, all of that provided a starting point for the even more massive transformations of government under the New Deal. The seeds planted earlier bore fruit when the next crisis hit.
That's a really powerful connection. It makes you think. Considering the pace of change we face today, AI, climate change, globalization, social shifts, what lessons from the progressive era stand out? That blend of citizen activism pushing for change and government responding with reforms. What's most critical for us to remember as we navigate our own version of rapid, disorienting change?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we harness both grassroots energy and effective governance to tackle today's challenges? The progressive era doesn't give easy answers, but it sure offers a rich case study.
It really does. It makes you think about that dynamic relationship between people demanding change, the power structures resisting or adapting, and the policies that result. Fascinating stuff. And on that thought, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Chapter 3 of Essential History for Public Administration. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of a truly pivotal era. We really hope you'll reflect on the parallels and the contrasts with our world today.
Yeah, understanding these historical shifts, how our institutions and norms developed, it's just invaluable for anyone interested in public policy and management. You see the roots of today's systems, the good and the bad, sometimes right here in the struggles and solutions of the past.
It really is essential history, offering deep insights into the ongoing challenges and opportunities of public service.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Please join us next time for another deep dive.